reading the law, and he discovered that it was possible that his friend Steve Harvey's civil rights had been violated when he was murdered at Liberty Memorial, and that gave him an opportunity to take it to the federal prosecutors, which he did, and ultimately put the man who murdered Steve Harvey in jail. Out of that experience at the library, both the Kansas City, Missouri and the Kansas City, Kansas public libraries, Alvin has created a career in which he's helped instigate literally dozens of what are called cold case civil rights cases, 30, 40, 50 years old. And we all know some of the things that happened around this country in the 1950s, in particular, where people were not, in the 1960s, people were not prosecuted, were prosecuted and let go. And Alvin has brought them to the forefront. And he's been so successful in doing this that Attorney General Holder, shortly after he took office, created a department of the Civil Rights Division of the Justice Department having to do with cold cases based on Alvin's work and the Emmett Till case. Alvin, we and Alvin and Monroe Dodd have published a pamphlet based on this, and we'll be doing a program on January 30th. And it is an example of someone using the library as a citizen to change the world, and change the world for the better. So I'd urge you to come to that program. Thank you. And then I'll mention two other programs we have. There's another one of my local heroes, Chuck Haddix, who has changed the world for the better, maybe not as dramatic a way as Alvin has, who has published his second book on Kansas City jazz. He's written the definitive history of Kansas City jazz, which Oxford University Press published a couple of years ago. He's now written a book on Charlie Parker called Bird, and he'll be in the library on this coming Sunday at the Central Library, and it's a wonderful book on Charlie Parker, who obviously is one of the most important figures in the history, not only of Kansas City jazz, but of jazz and American music. And then last but not least, I do want to mention on January 29th at the Central Library, we have Sean McMeekin coming to talk about his book, July 1914. You may have been, obviously this year is we're commemorating the first year in the First World War, and right now a lot of being talked about the origins of the war. And there are a number of very good books. Max Hastings, whom we've had in the library with his book Countdown, Margaret McMillan, whom we've had in the library with her book on the origins of the war, and Christopher Clark's wonderful book, and we will have him in the library someday. But maybe the best book is this Sean McMeekin book, July 1914. We had Jonathan Steinberg, who's written a prize-winning biography of Bismarck in the library a year or so ago. And Jonathan Steinberg said he had changed his views of his own book, reading the reviews and reading Sean McMeekin's work about the origins of the war. McMeekin wrote an earlier book called The Russian Origins of the War. His work in the archives has changed the history of the origins of the First World War. And his book, July 1914, is a day-by-day, almost hour-by-hour account from the assassination of Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo to the outbreak of war, and it's a great book. So I urge you to come and hear that too. But tonight we have a special pleasure. I've been trying to get Bruce Katz to the library for a long time. Bruce is the director of the Metropolitan Policy Program at the Brookings Institution. He's a vice president of the Brookings Institution. He is maybe not, I was going to say, an acknowledged expert on urban development, on cities generally. Maybe I should say the acknowledged expert on things metropolitan, things to do with the growth of cities at the moment when cities are becoming more and more important in the world. He was the chief of staff for the Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, has worked for the Senate, and now runs the Metropolitan Policy Program. So it is a profound pleasure for me to introduce Bruce Katz.
First of all, I just want to thank Crosby and everyone associated with this library. The programming you have here is just absolutely remarkable. And And, I'm here with a couple of colleagues, and I don't want to leave because I'm a history buff and I'm a silent movie buff, and I didn't realize Kansas City was the center of that universe. So congratulations to everyone. It's also a pleasure to be here with, David Warm and Jules Scotts and Bill Berkeley and the Kempers and, people who've really helped guide our work at Brookings for a long period of time. And it's particularly special to be back in Kansas City because I travel around the United States and I travel around the world. This is a very distinctive place. When you're here, its history is distinctive, its physicality is distinctive, and it's just wonderful to come back and see all the progress that is being made, particularly with the streetcar along Main Street, and how that is going to transform I think this region in some remarkable ways. So, serious topic, the Metropolitan Revolution, because I think everyone in this room knows we are living in a pivotal decade in this country. We're living in a pivotal decade because of profound demographic and economic and social forces and also political dynamics. And let's just start with the economic. We need to grow more jobs. We need to grow about 8 million jobs to make up the jobs we lost during the Great Recession. It was the reason it was called great. But we also need to grow better jobs, because what's less well understood is that the number of people who live in poverty and near poverty in our country went up by a quantum leap from 81 million in 2000 to 107 million in 2011. And that's why we're beginning to have a conversation about inequality. And what we're also beginning to have a conversation is about the economic vision and the growth model in the United States. We are slowly beginning to shift from a model which was characterized pre-recession by consumption and debt and frankly a lot of financial mischief, to one where we're getting back to fundamentals. An economy fueled by innovation, not just idea generation, but production. An economy powered by lower carbon sources of energy. An economy driven by global engagement, exports, trade, immigration. That's the way you build an economy that yields more and better jobs. We have one minor problem. The national government seems to have literally left the building. Occasionally you just see them running down the block. And it doesn't seem like they're coming back anytime soon because they really are riven by partisan and ideological divides. But there's a structural issue here, and I think this is really the more serious issue. We're seeing a profound change, and we knew this was coming, in what the national government actually does. Over the course of the next 10 years, because of the aging of our society, and because we have not kept our national fiscal situation as well kept as it should have been, we are going to see a radical shift in what the national government actually spends its money on. A large uptick in particular in the sort of so-called mandatory spending, which at the end of the day is really health care, social security, and income security. That will become essentially about 60% of our budget. And all those so-called discretionary spending items, defense, research and development, housing, infrastructure, education to the extent that they fund, those are going to be squeezed down. So the national government is essentially becoming a health insurance company with an army. And a memo is really being sent to the rest of the country. Oh, by the way, you're now in charge. It's not de jure, it's de facto. Now, this book is really a good news story because what we are writing about is cities and metropolitan areas and the networks of institutions and leaders who co-produce their economies and co-govern their communities, stepping up at a time of federal drift, to be kind, and doing the hard work to grow jobs and restructure the economy. We may be the only country in the world who can do this because we are the quintessential metropolitan nation. The top 100 metropolitan areas, these are cities and their suburbs together. These are the commuter sheds, the labor markets, the housing markets of the United States. The top 100, we have 400 in total, only the top 100, sit on 1/8 of the landmass. They're 2/3 of the population. They're 3/4 of the GDP. On every single thing that matters, whether it's skilled workers, whether it's infrastructure to move people and goods and energy and services and ideas, whether it's innovation, however we measure innovation, they are 75, 80, 85, 90% of the nation's share. So the United States is a powerful economic organization because we are a metropolitan nation. And China and India and Brazil and Mexico and many other emerging nations are becoming powerful because they are becoming more like us. They are urbanizing and they are industrializing. And what is happening around the United States, or cities and metropolitan areas, are understanding they literally are in charge, and they now need to channel their destiny, and in particular, they need to change their growth model. Listen to this.
For decades, the United States built its economy on debt and consumption. For cities, this meant throwing public money at sports arenas and stealing businesses from their neighbors with tax breaks. But what about after the game? You can't build an economy around beer and hot dogs. And what happens when the businesses you stole leave for a better deal somewhere else? The Great Recession was a wake-up call. We forgot the fundamentals. Productive and innovative growth drive consumption, not the other way around. Smart metro leaders are going back to basics, investing in infrastructure, making manufacturing a priority again, connecting small businesses with investors in new markets, helping workers get the skills they need. If metros get the basics right, the beer and hot dogs will follow.
By the way, you can download that for free on your app, or go to Twitter and download as well. So this is a book about stories. We start with Los Angeles. Depths of the recession. Los Angeles, the mayor, the business leader, the unions go to the voters and say, we're going to put forward a sales tax to build out transit in Los. I know this will sound strange, but Los Angeles actually is one of the most densely populated metropolitan areas in the United States. They pass a measure, tens of billions of dollars over a 40-year period, not just to move people through their congested metros, but to send a signal that Los Angeles will be a sustainable metropolis to attract talented workers and innovative firms going forward. We tell a story about Northeast Ohio, not just Cleveland, but also the metros of Youngstown, Akron, Canton, philanthropy and business coming together and saying, we make things, and what we need to do is help our small and medium-sized manufacturing firms continue to be globally competitive. And so they come together in support of these small and medium-sized firms, help them strengthen their business models, retool their facilities, retrain their workers so they compete on the global stage. New York City, under Bloomberg. 10 years ago, if you went to New York City and you said, what's your economic development plan? They were about to subsidize 2 stadia on the west side of Manhattan. A lot of beer and hot dogs, right? If you went there today, what Bloomberg was able to do, put about $100 million, actually he's very wealthy, so $100 million down of New York's capital budget to attract 2 world-beating institutions, Cornell and Technion, to Roosevelt Island, right? What would you rather have as your economic strategy? 2 stadia or 2 world-beating institutions which set a new institutional platform for innovative growth? Houston is one of the most diverse metropolitan areas in the United States. They have built a network of settlement houses, 21st century style, to help tens of thousands of immigrants get access to English as a second language, low-cost banking, health services, skills training, charter schools, because they understand these immigrants are the productive workers of tomorrow. Portland, Oregon, a very weird and crunchy place, right? Also an export powerhouse. They have set a goal to double exports, not only off of semiconductors and electronics, but off of sustainable products and services. If you Google, we build green cities, what pops up is Portland, Oregon. Because they understand that the cities in China and the cities in India and the cities in Brazil need our products and our services if they're going to grow in sustainable ways. Detroit, fiscally challenged, socially challenged. But if you go into the core of Detroit, only 3% of the land mass, 40% of the jobs, we are seeing corporate and civic leaders lead a renewal of the city from its core. Canada actually sits to the south. Wayne State, Henry Ford Health, Detroit Medical Campus, College for Creative Studies, tech and creative firms, the new spatial geography of innovation. And finally, Denver. I mean, Denver, which I think this region has a lot in common with, forget about the two-state borders, but a heartland metropolis. The story about Denver really is about how you build regional collaboration. Denver is about 2.6 million people. You're about 2, right? But it's a very fragmented region. And if you went to Denver 40 years ago, you would have seen cities and suburbs at each other's throat. What they were able to do by literally person to person, business leader to business leader, mayor to mayor, is build a coalition that started with culture. And you've done this with Union Station, right? A regional tax to basically build the arts and culture core of Denver Metro through an entire regional collaboration. What they then were able to do was to build institutions, both on the business side and on the political side, across mayors and across jurisdictions and across sectors, that literally had an armistice. We will not steal businesses from each other, because we understand to compete on the global stage, we have to collaborate to compete. And a dollar spent moving a company 2 miles across an artificial political border is a dollar that we could have used to invest in education or in transit or in innovation. What they were then able to do was to build a coalition, having built a coalition around culture and arts, a coalition around transportation and connectivity. It's not perfect, but they went to the voters like in LA, they passed the sales tax, $4.2 billion. They are building out the largest light rail system in the United States. Again, not just to move people, but to send a signal, we will be a sustainable metropolis, innovative firms, talented workers, come here. Let's listen to them.
The fact that we operate by consensus has meant that sometimes there have been some tough issues that we had to let go. It's more important to these mayors to be in collaboration, to be working together with each other than it is to be able to attack everything that comes down the road.
It's like a sibling relationship. There are some times when you have tremendous highs and things are running great, and there are other times where you're frustrated and you don't seem to understand where the challenges exist or why they exist at all. But if you care enough and if it's valuable enough to you, you will work on that relationship and do everything you can to always be prepared to get over those hurdles when they present themselves. There are many cities around the world thinking about how they can compete Denver, out-compete Los Angeles, out-compete New York. As a region, if we work together, we can compete against everyone else around the world, and we can do it well. We have a greater chance to be globally connected and globally competitive.
So that's the Denver story. And the last time I was in Denver, Governor Hickenlooper, who's the former mayor of Denver, was supposed to see him for dinner. And he sort of came up to me and apologized. And he says, we're having a sibling squabble today, so I need to cook dinner for the other mayors of the region. Sorry. But imagine that, right? Imagine that, a governor sitting down with mayors and county leaders and cooking them dinner, right? So that they could get beyond whatever the petty differences were and get back on the same page in the service of metropolitan regional prosperity. Those are the stories in our book. We're sticking to them. I mean, there could have been other stories, but they really are stories about, first and foremost, collaboration in the service of broader prosperity at a time of a federal vacuum, and a federal vacuum that is structural. So the question is, how do you start a revolution? And this is a bloodless revolution. So first is create a network. Cities and metropolitan areas are not governments. The federal government is a government. States are governments. Cities and metropolitan areas are networks of institutions and leaders that, again, co-produce their economies and co-govern their communities. The stories in our book are about different ways to build a network. In New York, in the depths of the recession, the reason why Bloomberg went out to attract Cornell and Technion to Roosevelt Island is because he crowdsourced the idea. They brought in hundreds of business, civic, and university and community leaders and said, Lehman has collapsed. This financial crisis is a New York crisis. We need to diversify our economy. And together they came up with the notion of we need to attract an engineering R&D kind of university like a Carnegie Mellon, like an MIT, like a Stanford. They settled ultimately on Cornell and Technion. So it was a leader crowdsourcing through a network. In Northeast Ohio, it's really a network of various institutions and intermediaries. The Fund for the Economic Future, philanthropic and business funded, is at the core, but then they work with clusters around biotech, around clean energy manufacturing, coming together around their manufacturing base. And Detroit, I like to say, is a loose affiliation of millionaires and billionaires. You know, to quote Paul Simon, maybe one billionaire. You know, Dan Gilbert, the head of Quicken Loans. It's an informal network that has come together to help renew the core. Once you have a network of leaders, you set a vision. And this is really important to understand the post-recession possibilities in the United States. Pre-recession, if we looked at Phoenix or Pittsburgh or Denver or Detroit, you know, it's almost like we thought the economy was ubiquitous and uniform, right? A Walmart is a Walmart is a Walmart. You go out to a suburban subdivision, they all look the same in the United States, same footprint, almost same design. But when you think about the traded economy, the firms that are in science, technology, engineering, math, maybe 20% of the economy, that's what's driving the rest of our economy. And so for cities and metropolitan areas, the key is what makes us distinctive and globally competitive. To quote one of the great American philosophers and economic theorists, Dolly Parton, figure out who you are and do it on purpose. And so, I don't think she was talking about regional economic, but I went a little fast there, so I'm going to just go back real fast. But what New York did was understand that they were too dependent on finance. They didn't have enough STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math in their system. That's why they wanted to attract a Cornell, a Technion, and now Carnegie Mellon into Brooklyn Navy Yard. Portland understood when they looked at themselves, guess what? We're an export powerhouse. And not only that, we're a clean economy powerhouse. And what do urbanizing cities abroad need? They need our products and services. And finally, Detroit, in a city of 138 square miles, was able to look at their core, again, only 3% of the land mass, but 40% of the jobs. That's our strength. Those are our assets. Those are our advantages. We will build from that. Final piece is find your game changer. When we think about the growth and evolution of American cities and metropolitan areas, or European or Asian or Latin American, there have always been a series of interventions over time. Maybe the location of an advanced research institution, maybe an infrastructure play. Maybe someone like Bill Gates decided to come home, right? Some of it is idiosyncratic and hard to predict or control, but some of it is really purposeful. There's always a series of actions that cities and metros have taken to put them on the right path. When you look at these stories in our book, New York or Northeast Ohio or Detroit, they're really all about innovation. And they're really all about the innovative economy. New York was trying to set a new institutional platform for innovation, because when it looked at itself, it said, we don't have a Carnegie Mellon or MIT or Cornell and Technion, we need one. Northeast Ohio was saying, manufacturing is not an old industry. It's not a dirty industry. 90% of the patents in the United States come out of our manufacturing sector. If we're going to be a great, prosperous nation, we need to make things again. And those places like Northeast Ohio that have that base, build on it, leverage it. That's what they're doing. And finally in Detroit, really interesting, what Detroit said was the spatial geography of innovation seems to be shifting in the United States and around the world. If you want to define the innovative economy 20 years ago, Get in your car, drive 30 miles to a science park, visit a corporate campus where people are working in isolation and keeping their ideas secret. If you want to find the innovative economy today, go to an anchor institution, advanced research institution like MIT, walk outside and begin to bump and mingle with a whole bunch of workers who want to be in a livable, walkable, hyper-caffeinated place, but also companies that want to be near other companies so that their workers can share ideas. That's the pharmaceutical sector, that's the tech sector, that's the creative sector. More and more what we are seeing is the spatial geography of innovation is shifting in the United States, and that's what Detroit is trying to do. And I think what you'll see in a relatively short period of time are changes that no one in this country would have expected given the fact that they've declared bankruptcy. But let's go back to the major point. In the next several years in the United States, it's home alone in the United States. It's home alone. Cities and metropolitan areas, particularly in this state and across the line, understand you're on your own. The cavalry is not coming. Leadership is going to have to come from the people in the room and others like you, corporate, civic, philanthropic, community, university leaders, who really set a course for your place and take the tough and make the tough strategic decisions. I think over the course of the next several years, while Washington continues to be on a frolic and detour, and many states drift, cities and metros will step up, and we will populate the map of our country with game-changing initiatives and transformative investments to get the nation back on track. And once we've done that, I think this is where we'll end up.
From an early age, we are taught how our nation is supposed to work. The president, vice president, and members of Congress sit at the top. Governors and legislators run their states. The rest of us take our cues from them. While states and the federal government may be part of the Constitution, our population and economic power is actually concentrated in our metropolitan areas. It's time to rethink power in America. In this century, metros will lead, and states and the federal government will follow. In cities and metros, public, private, and civic leaders are helping workers get the skills they need, investing in infrastructure and growing jobs through expanded trade and investment, the hard work necessary to renew our economy.
So I don't get invited to the White House anymore, but I will just say this, and this may sound harsh, but I think it is very realistic, particularly in our country, given our history. We're a nation now of 315 million people. We are still the most powerful economy on the face of this earth. We are powerful not because of 537 elected officials in Washington, D.C. We are powerful because we are a network of metropolitan economies with leadership across multiple sectors and multiple jurisdictions who, when they come together, can truly do grand things. This is an urban age. This is a metropolitan century. This can be a Kansas City moment. I look forward to the conversation with Crosby and David. Thank you.
That was great, Bruce. Thank you very much. We're now going to have a conversation in the light. Bruce and David Warmanine. David, as most of you know, I think, is the head of the Mid-America Regional Council. And a lot of what we're talking about is regional policy, and I would say no one in our community knows more about this region and regional policy than David, and he has not only a great local reputation, but a national reputation in that regard. I do also want to, I should have said this at the beginning, I want to thank the Civic Council who have made this happen, Jewel Scott, the Executive Director, who's here. And I also want to thank and tell you, just mention this fact because I think it's a symbol of what's going on in our community and in our region that's important and we have to build on. The Civic Council has a collaboration called the Heartland Civic Collaboration with other cities, with Des Moines, Omaha, and St. Louis, because some of these issues are regional in that large a sense that we need to be working on. And with us tonight in the audience are David Brown, who's president of the Omaha Chamber of Commerce, Greg Ewell, the executive director of Metropolitan Planning in Omaha, and Zach Young from Des Moines. So I want to thank them for being here and being a part of this discussion. And I want to particularly thank my friend Bill Berkeley, who is chairing the Heartland Civic Collaboration Committee of the Civic Council and is creating the regional envelope for us. Sorry, small joke there. So, Bruce and David, I want you to chime in on this because you are our expert here about this. When you showed your first slide and you showed the beer and hot dogs, the stadium, and the local subdivisions fighting over businesses with tax subsidies, one would have thought you were talking just specifically about Kansas City. And you know, we have lots of examples of that. My personal favorite is the moving, and personal favorite because it's so painful to me, moving of AMC across the state line, where we've ended up moving a large company from downtown into Johnson County with subsidy from the state of Kansas. About 3 weeks later, they were bought by a Chinese government-subsidized company, so that we've ended up with Governor Brownback, our most conservative governor, subsidizing the Chinese Communist Party. So, Bruce, can this possibly make any sense at all?
Well, it doesn't make any sense. And let me just, because I'm from Brookings, I always like to quote stats. What we have is an economic development culture in the United States at the city and metropolitan level that focuses on what I would call Starbucks stadia and stealing businesses. The stealing business part makes no sense because only 2% of the jobs that are going to grow in your community are going to come from companies coming from the outside. A lot of jobs are going to grow from startups and building off your base. So you should be doing economic gardening, understand who you are, begin to leverage off that very powerful base, as opposed to this delusional, we only bring this, and foreign investment is one thing, but to throw money at a company to move 2 miles is absolutely surreal. So we got to get back to fundamentals here. And if people are not shocked by what's happening in Washington, I don't know what you'll be shocked by. You're on your own, you have a scarce set of resources, use them strategically.
And David, Bruce mentioned in his remarks that at one moment we had a kind of regional cooperation that was maybe even a model at that moment for the nation, the bi-state tax. Didn't succeed. What's happened civically that takes us from that moment when we had great regional cooperation to the moment when we're sending Kansas money to the Chinese? Sorry, I won't beat that to death anymore, I promise.
I will add on to that because I think it's such a classic example of what we're not doing well. The scorecard on 2 incentive programs, Peak on the Kansas side and Missouri Works on the Missouri side, is that the Kansas communities have attracted from Jackson and Clay County about 3,400 jobs. Jackson County has attracted back about 2,900 jobs. So Kansas is up 400 jobs, and it cost $141 million to get those 400 jobs, which is about $340,000 per job. And so that gives you a sense, nobody's winning. We are all losing.
All that money would have built a great stadium.
Exactly. So that's an example of what we're not doing well. But one of the reasons I resonate with Bruce's book is because it kind of isolates a number of areas and really hones in on what they're doing extraordinarily well. And if you go to any one of their places, there's a lot wrong. We got a lot wrong, but we're also doing some things well. And what we're doing well, I think we're cooperating really well in sort of back office, in the streets, day to day, intergovernmental cooperation. City governments work together, they hang together, they've built some extraordinary assets together. We've got great civic leadership that engages. That's not true in every metropolitan area. We work across sectors really well. We built institutions like the Life Sciences Institute, which is doing extraordinary work. We collaborate across sectors and build things like the Area Development Council and the United Way and other kinds of institutions that are best-in-class kinds of organizations. What we haven't done, and what he really hones in on, is identify that game-changing strategy, stick with it, and nurture it over the long haul to really fundamentally address this question, which is the key question we face as metropolitan areas. What are we going to sell that's relevant to the world?
And Bruce, let's talk about that a little bit. A lot of your book, and a book that you talk a lot about in your book, and I think mentioned in passing today, Enrico Moretti's book on the new geography of jobs, a lot of it is about the comparative advantage, finding the comparative advantage of a given region, and you build from that comparative advantage. And Kansas City has some that are obvious. We've built a great ag science sector. We have a great financial service sector, digital marketing, digital logistics, Cerner, and their kind of informatics in the healthcare area. What can we build? Where is our comparative advantage in all that where we can sell to the world?
Well, a lot of this is again to understand, how you're distinctive. And to quote Jane Jacobs, who really wrote the urban book back in the early 1960s, the foundation of cities is trade. So when we talk about the advanced economy, whether it's manufacturing or services, and you really hit upon some of the ones that you excel in, the question is, what do you make? What services do you provide? What do you trade, and who do you trade with within the United States and across the globe? Because most of the growth in the world over the course of the next several decades will be outside the United States. So understand who your trading partners are around your key clusters and companies, and then begin to structure really what is the multi-layered relationships with these places. When I was thinking about and talking to your folks today in life sciences about animal health, what's really interesting to me is, who's obsessed about animal health, particularly about companion animals, right? We are. The Brazilians are. Most of my family lives in Brazil. Trust me, they are obsessed with their cats and their dogs. So, okay, that's interesting. What's your relationship with Sao Paulo? What's your relationship with the research institutions in Brazil? I mean, if this is a major market for you, what's the nature of it's not about Kansas City, Kansas versus Kansas City, Missouri. Right. It's about together, what are we selling, and how do we understand that our customers can become partners?
Let's think a little bit about what we're selling. Most of the companies that I mentioned, and I'd add the great engineering section, sector that we've got, Black & Veatch, Burns & Mac, Populous, HNTB, et cetera. Most of what they sell, or Cerner sells, or the financial services arena sells, is service. Right. It's not actually, you talked about making things, and I don't disagree. I think we always ought to be about making things in this country, but Kansas City seems to be a service sector-based economy, and it's, what do we do to pull that together, and where, it seems to me in a way we could sell that anywhere.
You can sell that anywhere, but there'll be certain markets for your products, and there already are. The question is ecosystem, right? It's the issue, are we talking about entrepreneurs, or are we talking about particular companies, or are we talking about clusters of firms and the ecosystem that surrounds those companies, advanced research class? And the question is, are those companies out on their own? I mean, are they? No, I don't think so. I think they need talented workers, so that affects your education and skills. They need research that can be commercialized coming out of your various university institutions or private R&D. They need to come together with your public officials, like they did in Portland around sustainable products and services. So public and corporate and civic and university are going together to the emerging markets and presenting a case. All that has
And let's talk a little bit, and David, please weigh in on this as well, the public-private partnership that you need to make a lot of these things work. We have an example of maybe how it's hard for us sometimes to do this. In the paper today of the airport, the City Council voted 9 months ago to spend $1.2 billion on the airport and got around to talking to the airlines yesterday, who said no. And there seems to me that there, with this tax subsidy view of the world that we have in the public environment, that we get obsessed. Our public officials get obsessed by stealing companies back and forth instead of enabling sectors. And how do we change that? I mean, New York obviously has gone through that. I think Ohio's gone through it. How did they change that? And David, maybe
I think we have two good examples where we're doing reasonably well in that regard, and one is around the animal and life sciences, where we have largely out of civic networks that began with civic networks, created institutions and sustained attention on those strategies. And what made it effective is that it happened over the long haul. It connected big institutions. They did it through a coordinated strategy. It involved different sectors, and it was comprehensive. There are workforce pieces to it. There's marketing pieces to it. There's research pieces. There's commercialization pieces. And bit by bit, we've rounded that out to the point that Johnson County voters made one of the smartest bets, in my view, in investing in the J-cert tax that is supporting that nexus of research and commercialization. And I think that that kind of strategy might be equally applied to some of these other areas where we have strengths, like advanced manufacturing, where we have more than our fair share of jobs, like in architecture and engineering, where we are a center of excellence for the world, really, around IT, Cerner and Garmin and other huge assets. One of the issues, though, with those big companies that are innovative and thought leaders is they are not spinning off small entrepreneurial commercial enterprises to the degree that they are in other metropolitan areas. That's a big question. Why not, and what do they need? Is it access to capital? Is it networks? Is it better relationships with external markets? I don't have the answer to it, but I think that is well worth our putting our civic attention to.
And so a question about that, the Johnson County tax to support this kind of thing was successful. We've just gone through a moment where we were very, very, very unsuccessful in passing a sales tax to support the life sciences, a medical translation tax on this side. What's the reason? It seems like a good idea to support these high-value jobs in research and development. Obviously, sales tax may or may not have been the best way to do that, but certainly there was a feeling of the voters that they weren't let in on this to some degree. It's a little bit like the airport. We decided we're going to do it, and then we talked to the people a little too late about it.
You know, at least in my view, in complicated issues, especially in regional affairs where you have so many constituencies and so many interests, there's some things that really matter. And leadership matters. And leadership seldom comes from institution, comes from people. Comes from people talking to each other, building networks and forming coalitions. And it comes from good processes of engaging people, of listening, of helping people shape and own ideas. And I think in the case of that, the processes weren't long enough and thorough enough for the voters to understand a very unique and novel and potentially powerful idea so that it made sense. And it also takes building trust. And you've got to figure out ways to build that trust and nurture that trust over time. And I think that the failure of that tax, maybe it was a bad idea, I don't know, but I think that it was not a referendum on this idea of working collaboratively in strategic investments and using public dollars. I think it was both the construct of the idea, the timing of the idea, and the communication around the idea that it was too much to ask in too short a time.
And Bruce, you mentioned Denver in your remarks, and there's a longer explanation and description of what Denver went through. They went through a moment like this where they turned some things down
Absolutely.
regionally, but they came back from it. And your description of Governor Hickenlooper, I assume it was probably beer battered chicken or something that he fed the other the mayors and whatnot. But is that what you do?
I think it was Kansas City chili or whatever. No, Cincinnati
barbecue. We do barbecue here.
I know.
But I mean, is the first network we've got to have our public sector and our private sector leaders getting together like that informally and coming together around a program?
You know, I think there's a couple different routes that are emerging here. I think recessions or at least the ones that call great, I think have a very disruptive effect. When I look around the country right now, what I see are a set of new institutions emerging, or old institutions repurposing. Portland, Minneapolis, St. Paul, Memphis, even Chicago. Institutions where formally business leaders and political leaders are sitting around a table together. In fact, they all have skin in the game, coming up with a unified narrative, being very clear and frank and objective about what their assets and what their liabilities are, and then choosing a series of initiatives to pursue over time. I think that is the post-recession model. And so I think this may require you both to have networks of business leaders and political leaders and other leaders who sit together by themselves, but also beginning to find new institutional arrangements. The other thing that happened in Denver is they really did have an armistice. They stopped stealing from each other. And I think that was the early 80s crash, frankly. I think that sent a signal to Denver: if we don't get our act together, we are in deep, deep trouble. So it takes sort of a crisis in many of these places. Think about the Lehman collapse in New York City, right? Think about the quiet crisis in Northeast Ohio that led to this renewed support for manufacturing. Portland, in the aftermath of the recession, had double-digit unemployment and was really quite concerned. My sense is Kansas City at times, you're one of those regions in the United States that performs well enough not to feel like you're in crisis.
Well, and maybe Brookings has produced for Mark and for the Civic Council some numbers, and might be, we talked about comparative advantages we've got. It might be a good moment to talk about some of the problems we've got, because maybe people aren't aware of some of the difficulties we've got. The numbers that you have produced show, among other things, relative to a peer group nationally and also to pretty much all of our competitive regional cities, our productivity has grown slower.
That's right.
Our GDP, our gross product, grown slower. Our debt has grown, and I want you to talk a little bit about that substantially. So we've got the highest debt per capita in the region. Our taxes are among the highest of any city in the country that's not Detroit or Bridgeport or Chicago. And our cost of living, which used to be one of our great advantages, which was much lower than the national average, is now about the national average. And so people don't, I think, are not aware of this. So I'll ask the question in a short way. Do things like taxes and debt matter in a region? Are these things for us to be worried about? And if we are worried about them, what can we do about to set a base for growth?
I think they do matter. They're not the only things that matter. And again, everyone has a certain hand, and you have to play it in a particular way. You're a very large metropolis, land mass-wise. This is a very large city, land mass-wise, right? So there's a lot of infrastructure here, like a crazy amount of infrastructure, which has to be maintained. I mean, David knows this because he lives this on a day-to-day basis, right? So there's a reality to how you've grown and developed in the 20th century that is beginning to play out and bite you in the 21st century, particularly as this spatial geography of innovation is shifting. Now you're shifting with that. When I see the creative cluster growing up around, Union Station and Crossroads and, so forth and so on, you are shifting some of your geography to reflect this desire for a proximity and density that not just workers are saying, or creative workers, but firms are increasingly saying. But I would say more broadly in the region, because in many ways there's a lot of wealth in this region. You need to think about your region as a series of balance sheets. It's the public balance sheet, tax, debt. It's also private balance sheets and civic balance sheets. And how are you deploying those resources? In Northeast Ohio, or frankly in St. Louis, philanthropy has begun to deploy their balance sheet in the service of economic restructuring. They're not just cleaning up the mess left by the failed economic model. They're now helping to invest in startups, helping to invest in applied research, helping to invest in manufacturing. Very different use of the civic balance sheet, and also a very different use, for example, of Washington University or MIT or Carnegie Mellon or Georgia Tech. So I think, broadly speaking, what you need is networks of leaders and broader citizenry understanding you need to know who you are, then build off that base in very smart and strategic ways, but deploy all your assets.
You've talked about this a little bit in passing, and one of the central messages, I think, of your book, of Moretti's book, of Ed Glazer's book, Triumph of the City, and a lot of the best analysis, and David and I have talked about this, is you want to be a magnet for talent. And one thing we haven't talked about yet is we do have one sector besides the engineering and financial services and the bio parts of the world where we are probably doing better than any city our size in the United States, and that's in our culture, our culture of performing arts, the plastic arts, what's happening at the Kaufman Center, the ballet, the opera, the symphony, the rep, the crossroads you mentioned, the creative class, digital marketing, which builds off that. Can we make that a central focus for attraction, and can that be a place for the public-private partnership to work?
Absolutely. I think, we talk a lot at Brookings around the STEM economy, science, technology, engineering, math. We are just beginning to assess the STEAM economy, where we throw in arts, and frankly, we could throw agriculture in there so that STEAM just, sort of elongates. But that's what you're good at. And the question then becomes, how do you commercialize innovation? How do you take startup companies, 2, 3 employees, and begin to build mass? And then how do you put an entire community behind that and begin to change the resource allocation and the investments of some of your large institutions? I was in a city, nameless, about 3 months ago, and I was sitting on a panel with a cultural institution with an $800 million endowment, and I was sitting next to a philanthropic community with an endowment of a couple billion, and et cetera, and I was politely asking them, what are you investing your endowment in? Are you investing in Brazil, or are you investing in your own community? And let's just say, just take 10% and start putting it back in your community. I mean, this is the kind of I think everyone's going to have to face this reality, because the scale back of the federal government is here. It is not going to be pretty, and a whole bunch of stuff that 5 years ago David might have said, I'll put a grant into DOT. Guess what? You're going to have to raise it from here. So this is a really different period we're about to go through. You've got to think about a broader set of resources.
And both David and Bruce, so if we're going to choose, and I know you don't absolutely choose one or the other, but if we're going to focus, and you have a choice between early childhood education or higher education, or broadband or light rail, which of those do you choose? I mean, isn't education the place we want to invest this money, or do we do later stage and do angel investing? Does everybody get into angel investing?
I actually think these are very different things, and therefore, on broadband, frankly, I think a lot of broadband connectivity, particularly to advanced research, will be financed by the private sector and off of, universities. Their balance sheet.
If we have a chance in Kansas City right now with Google Fiber and the attention, and we've got Internet 2 coming into the city, shouldn't we take advantage of that now?
You should absolutely take advantage of that, but you should do it in such a way where it really is supportive of advanced industry, advanced sectors. You could wire up large portions of your region and not have the economic effect.
So downloading Downton Abbey more quickly is not...
No, I don't think. I think we can all wait 10 more seconds to watch the latest episode of Breaking Bad. But if you want to do big data computation among certain companies in certain places, go for that.
And do we have that going on, David?
Yeah, I mean, in fact, there is a pretty coherent strategy for taking advantage of the high-speed fiber network that's being built here. It's a short-term advantage for this region because soon it will be everywhere, built by the private sector. But we do have some movements and some strategies in place. In fact, they're on our website if anybody wants to take a look at it. I think these are really two sides of the same coin, Crosby. You know, what really drives an economy, and Brookings has helped us think through some of these kinds of things, are being really good at something that's globally relevant. They are having innovation and entrepreneurship ecosystems that help spin-offs, and they are having really talented people. Those are the three things that produce stuff. And we've got to put some civic attention in a coordinated way at a regional scale around that three-part agenda. Having said that, in order for us to build those systems, it's going to require some enablers that frankly are on the public side of the ledger sheet. And these are things like efficient infrastructure, a really quality community environment, having sensible tax policy that isn't about stealing but is about investing. And those are the big public policy questions that we've got to grapple with. And so I don't feel like it's a matter of we've got to pick one and just work on early education and everything else will take care of itself. We have to have coherent, comprehensive, long-term, sustained strategies focused on our drivers that are supported by meaningful community investments that create a healthy context for these drivers to succeed.
But there is a question of focus and shifting resources. So we're spending $100 million or more on light rail. $100 million goes in tax subsidy, real estate tax subsidy to corporations in the Kansas City, Missouri budget. And I don't know what we're spending on broadband or on education, but it's not a lot out of the city budget. Not anything in those. Just to cut to the chase, shouldn't we shift the public money with private collaboration into things that have more, that are true investments and have a longer term return?
Yeah, I would say, I have two answers to that. One is that the sort of the analysis you gave of high taxes and where the problem is partly the fact that Kansas City, Missouri is making these investments without taking advantage of a regional tax base. We don't have the mechanisms in place that allow us to do these things at a regional scale and invest in them at the right scale, so the burden is falling in a fairly narrow part of the population. And that's a problem in and of itself. It is one of the inefficiencies of the way we operate. But then secondly, I would say that for many of the drivers, these things like focusing in on industry clusters or building innovation ecosystems don't require a lot of public money. They really require private and civic organization and network and private investment capital. Things like human capital do require a lot of public money. Early education, quality public education, that requires a lot of public money. And so if we save money in tax incentives and put it into public education or put it into sound infrastructure systems, I think that makes sense. But the issue there is finding the big bet within those areas and doing that well. So in our spatial alignment, in my view, investing in a transit system that allows us to create a denser urban form that creates wealth, saves infrastructure costs, and responds to the market realities is a good bet. Now, how we're financing it, who's financing it, what debt we incur over what period of time is a really important set of questions, and we ought to do that in a sensible, thoughtful way. Doesn't mean we shouldn't take it on in a strategic way within our means and within a time frame that makes sense.
So I would agree with everything David said. I would also say, and this is an outsider coming just into the city, and there will be comparable assets in the broader metropolis, but the historic stock you have in this region is remarkable. A lot of cities destroyed what they had in the 1960s and the 1970s. You still have this amazing stock of warehouse buildings, older properties that can be repurposed. I mean, and you're doing that. And that means you can grow a very distinctive kind of density. In terms of the three-part strategy, stop the stupid stuff. Just stop the stupid stuff. B, with regard to a whole bunch of things, there's a lot of money in the system. It's just not being put to the right purpose. You know, we have schools that are teaching to test and not for 30 or 40% of their kids, helping them move from school to work. That's about what we used to call shop or voc ed, or sort of modernized into the 21st century. You have to get back to that. And third, make some very strategic bets around, not what New York is doing or what San Francisco is doing, what Kansas City needs to do, given who you are. That might end up being universal pre-K. It might end up being, a particular pool around translational research. But the first two, people usually skip to the last one. Because you're doing a lot of stupid stuff, it's easier to stop it, And then this shift about your existing resources really is fundamental.
Let me ask you one last question, building off something that's in your book and you mentioned in passing about Houston, and maybe we'll take 3 or 4 questions from the audience. And that is about diversity.
Yes.
You make a good case, it seems to me, about immigration and diversity, particularly talking about Houston, and then you mentioned the neighborhood centers. And Kansas City in the 1930s advertised itself as the most American city, which the Chamber of Commerce meant, by which the Chamber of Commerce meant we've got the fewest immigrants. But that's changed, and we now have one of the faster growing, it's still fairly small, but one of the faster growing immigrant populations, and the demographic studies that you've done, Mark, and the Civic Council have done show that we're going to be a substantially Hispanic community in our metro area 50 years from now. And is this a good thing, or is it a thing that's open to things that we can do with it? Welcoming it in the right way.
Well, I think the United States is demographically blessed. Many of our competitors are hitting a demographic wall. They're aging without a replacement population. And they are not welcoming to immigrants. The United States is an immigrant nation. We have our hiccups. We have our times in the 20s through the 60s where we just stop it. But I think we're on a path now of understanding what it means to a country that can grow 20 million people a decade, 30 million people a decade. The Germans would love to have this, right? The Chinese, are having the Japanese are having a huge problem adjusting to their demographic situation. So we are demographically blessed. The question is whether we are smart about leveraging it, which is really the Houston example, because they're leveraging it in several ways. I mean, they really are trying to assimilate and integrate immigrants the way we used to in the early part of the 20th century. The neighborhood settlement house network that we talk about in our book was started by Jim Baker's grandmother. And the former Treasury Secretary, former Secretary of State. And so the major cultural center is called Baker Ripley in her honor. And leadership, corporate, civic, Democrat, Republican, liberal, support this because they understand this is Houston's future. And so what our demographic base gives us is, first of all, a replacement worker population as we age, but second, it gives us a window to the world. We didn't have colonies in the United States for the most part. We're not like European nations. What we have is the world in a zip code, or the world in a nation. And that's the way we can reach the rising nations of Latin America, the rising nations of Africa, the rising nations of Asia, through our demographic population. We are blessed. So we should stop the crazy conversation that goes on in Washington. And whether they pass immigration reform or not, you need an immigrant policy to be welcoming and to leverage the assets that you have.
Great. Well, on that note, I would invite 3 or 4 questions. We don't have time for a lot of questions, so those of you who are fastest to the microphones, we have 2 microphones up here. And perhaps our first question will come from Mr. Kirk.
Is this on?
It is on.
Your comment about institutional rearrangements reminded me of 2 things. In the early days, cities that shared a navigable port often formed port authorities, because then they'd have a vibrant port that would benefit them all. And of course, the Greeks had city-states. And when I hear you talking, I wonder, we have 5 or 6 counties and 13 or 14 cities, and we've only created a couple institutional, we got a Chamber of Commerce that bridges those, and we some of the excellent work that David does, but how do you get all these different fiefdoms to unify, for example, in regional economic development? Each one of those little areas and across the state are hungry for jobs. What do you reinstitutionalize the way you deal with that? Or how do you bring about change as opposed to individual survival techniques as opposed to collaboration?
So in some respects, in my view, you're not that fragmented, right? Because I'm working in places, take Chicago. Chicago has 554 municipalities, right? They have organized a Metropolitan Mayor's Caucus. They have to send delegates from different parts of the region because you can't fit 554 people in a room and have a clear conversation, right? Allegheny County, which includes Pittsburgh, has 130 municipalities. You want fragmentation? You know, there are a lot of places, the state line is one thing, but in terms of your units of local government, you can fit them in one room, and this is at some level, this is about people in the business community, in the elected community, in the civic community, really doing what happened in Denver. Let's put down the arms. Let's reach across the aisle, so to speak, or across the jurisdiction, and let's begin to find our areas of common ground. And let's do some great things together. I think this is doable, but it's not about, abstract institutions or forces that are beyond our control. This is fundamentally within our control. And once metros come together, then you go to your state house and your delegation, and ultimately your national delegation, and remind them, last time we checked, it's a representative democracy. You work for us. Here are our priorities. We would like you to be in the service of. Speak with one voice, and so you don't repeat the squabbling among your delegation or delegations. I think this is fundamentally doable because it's about people coming together.
Here. Here. Yes, ma'am.
When I read your book, one of the things I found most interesting about it is that a lot of books about the new economy talk about how the internet is causing everybody can do everything from so far away, and yet the picture that you painted was of that clustering. Yes. And how just being a block away, even though you can use the internet, you can have international business, how important that proximity was. And in Kansas City, we're very spread out, like you said, we're gigantic. And I see a lot of people who are not forward thinking with transportation. When I talk to a lot of civic leaders, a lot of people want transportation and want to have that investment, but it doesn't look like it's happening at the speed that it should be, given just how much we're sprawling. How do you think we can fix that?
Well, I think you've really pointed out, a major insight, right? Which is the futurists predicted 30 years ago we were all headed into the mountains, assuming we can get Wi-Fi or internet access, and we were all, the fact is, people are social animals. For the most part, they like to be near other people, and particularly when you're in the innovative economy, and a large portion of the economy is innovative, you want to have that synergistic effect with sharing ideas. I think the only thing that I would say is this is not a peripheral matter. If everyone in this room could be transported to the Research Triangle Park outside of Raleigh-Durham, this is the most successful science park in the United States, carved out of 7,000 acres of pine land, dozens of miles away from the downtowns of Raleigh and Durham. Okay, the entity that runs Research Triangle Park basically has come to the conclusion, if they do not urbanize, if they do not create a walkable community, if they don't bring housing onto the campus, if they don't give people access to retail and other amenities, if they don't have biking, if they don't have transit connectivity, they are toast. Toast. Because companies will say, well, just go to Raleigh-Durham. It's authentic. It's real.
And we can have that productive, profitable effect of being near each other. Major financial institutions and innovative companies are basically shifting their model. And I think, so, it's not a theory anymore. It's not the nice thing to do or the sustainable thing to do. It is the profitable thing to do, to embrace cityness and revalue cities and proximity and density. And you can do that in suburbs. This is not just about cities. You can do that because all you have to do is come to Washington, D.C., Bethesda, Maryland, suburban area on a transit line is about as vibrant and vital as you can get. So this is not just about core central cities. It's about what people want. They want centers again. They want to connect and what companies want. So this is a challenge to everyone. The United States was on a sprawl binge for 60, 70 years, low density development. And we are now going to have to adjust and adapt to new, profound market and demographic dynamics.
Thank you. I want to thank you for bringing us a model of what you might call a democratic economy and with widespread participation. How about the role of these super big companies, these super rich individuals, the Boeing that blackmails the community into submission, the infamous Koch brothers? Do we defend against that? Do we plan for that? What do you do with these people?
Well, I think with Boeing, I think there might be one answer if you're Seattle and another answer if you're any other place. Because the fact is with the aerospace industry, it is highly localized in the United States and around the world. In North America, it's basically Montreal, Seattle, Wichita, and a couple other places, including rising Mexico. So the fact of the matter is, I'm not entirely sure that Seattle had a choice. But in some respects, it's no different than sports teams that threaten to leave. And 15 years after you built them one stadium, they demand another one. For other cities that were about to throw a lot of money at Boeing, I would think twice about that, because it's not...
St. Louis was, and the state of Missouri was going to throw a huge amount of money. And after they decided to stay in Seattle, some of the members of the legislature announced they were just ready to do this again.
Well,
I don't... With Bombardier as well.
I don't see what the return on investment of that is. Because the real return on investment is when you have an ecosystem at scale. And you're not just a peripheral assembly site, but you're the site of advanced research, and you're the site of the advanced support, and you're the site of the advanced you're everything. So I think this, at the end of the day, was something equivalent to what goes on with our sports teams. And so, there's a desperation out there, is really what I think this revealed more than anything else. It revealed places that are desperate for the advanced economy at a time when the national government has not reset the rules. So there's a lot of more structural things we can do so that going forward, I think we can dial down what are, these smokestack chasing kind of exercises.
Sure.
I've got a comment and a question. The comment is, listening to your discussion, it seems like kind of conspicuous by its absence is a blind spot to all these employees and wage earners and salaried employees. I don't know if they're not being considered or that's just not the subject of the conversation tonight. My question is, my daughter a few years ago had a chance to go to New York City on vacation. And she came back and she brought me a souvenir. It was a little shot glass. It had a very nice little shot glass that had the skyline of New York City all around it. I looked at the bottom of it and it said, "Made in China."
Yeah.
What should we infer from that about the way the economy works in international trade? New York City has to import their souvenirs. And I can't help imagining somebody from the rising middle class in Shanghai taking a trip of a lifetime to New York City, picking up one of these shot glasses, a souvenir of New York City, taking it back, showing it to their neighbor, and he said, "Oh, I made that over across the street. I manufactured that down there." That's my question is, what does that tell us?
So two thoughts. First, on I think the implication of your first comment.
We've had wage stagnation in the United States for a large portion of our workers for a very long period of time. Americans need a salary increase. And I think what's going to happen in cities, in metros, in states, is we're going to have efforts to boost wages. The minimum wage has been capped for a very long time. It has not kept pace with inflation. We need to raise it. The only question is how high. And we need to upgrade the education and skills of our workers, not just with four-year degrees, but with practical technology skills. So we have to boost wages. And we're going to have to start, I think, at this level, because Americans have not gotten a salary increase for quite some time. And social civility can only hold for so long in that situation. You know, on the second point, look, we are an advanced economy. And, you know, I'm not sure in the sort of global distribution of who does what. I don't tend to worry about the Chinese making our souvenirs. What I worry about is the Chinese making airplanes, and the Chinese building and graduating, you know, or building advanced research institutions and graduating more engineers than we can. So we got to keep our eyes on the prize. We are an advanced economy. 20% of the economy drives the other 80%. And we got to keep on pace with that. With 3D printing, maybe we will start making these souvenirs, you know, in small batch little offices in crossroads. So, you know, it could be that, you know, the time of cheap manufacturing has ended. There's a piece today by an economist out of California about manufacturing is going to come back in droves. I'm not sure if that's true, but 3D printing is a disruptive technology. But bigger point, advance skills. We have to get back to fundamentals here. We lost sight for a long time, both parties. Let's get back to fundamentals.
Last question. Dan Coffrin, who, by the way, is the chair of the Citizens Association, which is helping sponsor this kind of civil and civic dialogue in the library regularly. Dan?
Thank you, Crosby. To the extent local governments
Yes.
are an important element of this regionalization, to what extent have these successful cities dealt with what I think probably occurs there and occurs here, and that is the distrust or at least skepticism that the suburban communities have regarding the central city municipality, where central city governments are seen as profligate spenders, corrupt, what have you. And so when you want to talk to them about building a metropolitan tax base, you know, they're not really too interested in that. And I see that as a big problem here in our metropolitan area. We've only succeeded, I guess, maybe once with a true metropolitan-wide tax. Have these other cities had that problem? And if so, how have they dealt with it successfully?
So I think we've had a long period of time in the United States, really since the end of World War II, where cities and suburbs have been incredibly divided, and political leaders have taken advantage of that. And frankly, metropolitan areas and non-metropolitan areas have been incredibly divided, and political leaders have taken advantage of that. So what we see happening in places like Denver, or frankly Chicago, a place where the divisions were incredibly difficult and complicated, is what I was describing before, is one-on-one, right? Mayors of central cities sitting with county leaders, sitting with leaders of suburban municipalities, and the forms of governance shift around the United States, right? And literally breaking bread, right? No media in the room. This is not a photo op. We're not having a press conference. We're having a conversation about what matters to us. What matters to us is the future of our region and our children, and whether they can stay here and grow the good life as we were able to do in many parts of this country. This is really about leadership at the end of the day, but leadership in a quiet way, where you're able to really find out what unifies you and not divides you. And then ultimately you can go to the citizenry
and saying, we don't love each other. It's not nirvana, but on these three things, we've decided to work with each other because that's what you're paying us to do. And so that's adulthood, you know, as opposed to the kind of what passes as teenage behavior in a lot of metropolitan areas. It ain't easy. Washington's gone. We know what they're acting like. It's like a high school, you know, with I forgot what the warring gangs were in West Side Story, but
The Crips and the Bloods.
the Crips and the Blood. So we know what Washington
Sharks and
is.
the- yeah. Yeah.
State capitals are not that much different from that for the most part. The children in our system have become the adults. Let's act like it.
Great. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank you all for caring about our city. And Bruce Katz for being here to talk about it. Thank you. And Bruce's book is for sale out here from our friends at Barnes & Noble. Be happy to sign copies.
Absolutely.
And again, thank you all for being here. Thanks to the Civic Council, to David Warman, the Mid-America Regional Council.